Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and in front of you can see there's two bins here. These bins were built 6 days ago now, and that was done just a couple hours after I had last fed those three bins on the top shelf there. Those three bins are red wiggler bins that were also fed 6 days ago, and it was mainly because when I was feeding those bins 6 days ago, the way that I fed them was to feed them on the very edge of the bin, and then that encourages the worms to come over to the food that's in the bin. And at this point, after 6 days in all three of those bins, I would have to assume that those feeding zones are pretty well populated. So, with that in mind, and since it was always the plan in the first place, I'm gonna be extracting some worms from those bins over there, and I'm gonna be using those worms to launch off one of these bins today. And once the bin receives its new population of worms, on will go the label for today's date, but not until it's populated with worms. So it's a little bit of a process. So let's go ahead and get those bins that have the worms on them up here on the bench so we can start extracting the worms. And when we've got a fair amount of them assembled, we'll go ahead and we'll cut them loose into one of these two bins here. All right, let's get to work. Okay, I got my gloves on so we can scoop out the worms, and I've got a bin to put them into. Not much of a bin, just a little plastic tray, good sturdy plastic tray. And I'm pretty sure we're going to come close to filling this thing up. Let's go grab the first bin. Now technically this bin is the oldest of all my bins, but I don't think it's going to have the greatest number of worms. I think that the youngest of the bins is really going to be the one with the greatest number of worms in it. We'll save that one for last. We'll start with this one. And the reason I'm thinking that this is going to have the fewest is only because it was only last week that I set this up 6 days ago with the horizontal migration. Up until then, this bin had been getting fed down the middle, whereas the other two bins, they've been in this horizontal migration mode for a number of feedings now. So chances are in those bins, after something like 32 days or 33 days, this is the only side that's been fed in there, so I would think a large number of worms have made their way in there already. In this bin, on the other hand, 6 days, so we'll get to see how much of a migration we were able to spur on with this. So I think I'm going to use this covering piece of paper and flip it over like this. And then I'm going to take some of this covering material that the feeding zone was covered with and just set it aside here on the paper. So as we get down into the material and we take off the covering, we can already see little bits of movement here and there. Some worms cruising around. And I was wondering what this thing was here with this real distinct cut edge on it. And I'm just realizing now that it's a piece of bread. You can see right away, a pretty good number of worms have made their way over to the bread. It's being eaten nicely. So let's just set that aside and we'll keep that for when we reload here. Because after the worms come out, I'm just going to have to reload this here and allow this migration process to continue. And it's for that reason I want to see if I could just try to preserve as much of the material and bring over only worms if I can, while I'm doing this. But I should also, try to be realistic about this, keeping in mind that it has only been a week, not even, since this bin was set into this horizontal migration mode. And it is pretty possible that the previous feeding zone that was down the middle might still have a pretty good amount of food remaining in it, so the worms are probably not really looking for a new place to feed. They were probably pretty comfortable right where they were at. So we'll see what we can do as far as rounding up some volunteers. I don't know if we might be able to just shake some of them off, some of the food items, but then put the food items aside so we can use them when we reload. I guess the other approach that I was considering was just kind of grabbing the worms wholesale with the food that they're burrowing in and that they're occupying at the present time, and just bringing all that over into the new bin with them. I guess we'll come up with some sort of a combination of everything. Maybe I could do a scoop and then try to take out the really large pieces that still want to stay here in this compost bin. And like here, go to the really juicy fruit pieces where we could probably get a good number of them with just one quick easy grab. Okay. It's a little bit dry down here, I gotta say. This is kind of cool. This will stay here in this bin, I believe. It's the pumpkin stem. It's kind of cool how they've made their way down into that little hole in the middle. There's just so many of them in there. They could barely fit down into that hole. It's so cool. So we'll leave that. It's kind of a memento of this bin's previous assignment. It's the time lapse of a little pumpkin that sat in this bin for a number of weeks, getting consumed by the worms. Maybe we won't rely so heavily on the worms that we extract from this bin. We'll bank on the fact that we're probably going to get a whole lot more of them out of the other two bins where that horizontal migration's been going on for much, much longer. Don't want to take any of this bedding with me. Let's see if I can grab maybe one or two more handfuls of these little volunteers. Keep this pumpkin stem here in the middle. Yeah, you know what? Let's leave that as all the worms that we're going to take out of this bin today. Before we put the bin away, though, I've got some fresh stuff to throw down in here. This is the perfect time to scoop up a few more because they are in big numbers right along the bottom here. Okay, that'll be enough for this bin. But yeah, down here in this feeding zone, to try to keep spurring on the migration of worms out of the bin into this edge, let's throw in a little bit of fresh bedding to go down to the bottom. You know what? Instead of fresh bedding, yeah, let's put the fresh bedding on the bottom. I think for bedding here, I'm going to use leaves only. Since this bin is in its home stretch, or nearing the end of its life cycle, I want to provide materials that break down quickly and easily. So I think the leaves is the best bet for that. Cardboard, I believe, would take a little bit longer. So we'll try to keep these feeding zones being constructed with materials that they're definitely going to gobble down quickly. So I just took some of the larger chunks of food that I found when I pulled the materials all out, laid them back down in here again, and I think we'll save the rest to do the final cover up. Let's give them a fresh banana peel, a handful of cucumber skin shavings. It's an entire cucumber that appears to have gone quite bad. And you know what? Let's give them a second banana. How does that sound? Mainly banana and cucumber. Good, hearty feeding. I just had to take this little guy and throw him back in here. He was trying to escape from this container. Stay in here, buddy. Go hang out in the cool material. Better keep an eye on these guys. It is pretty cool, though, how they all just retract down into the material. You pretty soon won't even be able to see one of them. Kind of like this guy right here. He'd be better off just going down instead of coming up. The paper's going to be awfully dry. Probably be better in the material. Okay, so I also have here some bread. Experimental bread. The recipe didn't quite work out, so the worms get to eat it. provide these feeding zones with some grid as well. And before we cover it all up, we'll include our customary portion of coffee for them. All right, we'll throw this other pumpkin stem in the middle as well. And then we'll just use the remainder of this material here to cover the feeding zone back up the way it was. Okay. Well, I'm not going to pick around in here. I'm curious to see how things are progressing, but I'm not that curious. I'm more interested in getting to the finish line, which is going to be to release these worms, our first batch of volunteers, into their new home. But before we could do that, we've got to go get ourselves 2 more batches of volunteers. So we're on to bin number 2. And this brings us on to bin number 2. Where once again we're feeding along the edge. That's why there's a marker there. Except on this occasion, I believe we're probably going to do maybe a little bit better. Maybe a little bit better than we did in the previous bin. I think we'll use the same technique. It seemed to work pretty good. And that assumes that we do have enough material here on the top edge to reuse. Although this is an extremely busy bin. It's not even as busy as the last bin that we're going to check in on. So this is just going to get increasingly busier. And here already you can see large numbers of worms hanging out right near the top of the surface. So I'm trying to see if we can come up with a good, quick way of snatching a whole bunch of volunteers, leaving as much of the castings and their food material as possible behind. So we'll leave that banana peel. We'll try to, oops, maybe I should have shook the banana peel over the, over my tray here. Get these guys in here too. Let's see if I can perfect this technique. Maybe I could just grab a good large hunk like this and then start picking out the food scraps that are just going to go back in. Not even sure what this is. Mango. Yeah, I think we've got most of the large chunks separated out. Maybe that's the thing, is just to drop in a whole bunch of them, let them burrow down, and then just skim off the junk that they leave on the top of the surface. Oh wow, here we got a lot. Good large hunk. Lots and lots of worms. Okay. But although, you know, we're going to let them dive as well while we're waiting, we could definitely try to pick off some of these larger pieces that are obviously best off staying here in the active bin. Although, best off, I can't say that for sure. It probably wouldn't matter much if we brought along a bunch of uneaten food and bedding and stuff from the old bin. I just like the idea of it being sort of a mass of worms as opposed to a mass of all kinds of stuff. So we'll see what we could do in terms of picking out some of these large chunks. Well, I better not forget that I've still got another bin of volunteers to pick out of too, so maybe maybe I'll let these guys dive down for a second or two. In the meantime, we could restore their feeding zone here with some fresh stuff. Although down here, it just seems like I get a huge mound of volunteers effortlessly. Yeah, this is a very, very busy bin. I guess my hope is that by alleviating some of the numbers of worms in here, it'll make room for other worms from throughout the bin to make their way over here as well. So, okay, one more time, just a little bit of leafy matter at the bottom. Here too, we're going to drop in a couple banana peels, cucumber, and I think some potato. Okay, so give them a little of this, a little of that. Hopefully they'll like that bread, a little change of pace for them. Then we can return all of this extracted material back onto the feeding zone, which, as it turns out, consists heavily of lots of worms. Look at all these. I can't resist pulling a few more volunteers over, since they're all just right out here in plain view. Maybe we can put some of this stuff that's surfacing here as they burrow back into here. Well, we've got all kinds of stuff floating around here on the top. Banana peels, maybe I can sort of help some of those larger items to go down under the surface a bit more. And I think here maybe we can sprinkle on a little bit more fresh leaf cover. Don't need much. Okay, very cool. Make sure we don't have any stranded worms here on top of the dry paper. Cool. One more bin. Okay, this is our last batch of volunteers. This has been working pretty well, so let's continue with this technique of using the paper here as sort of a catch for anything that we think we might be able to return back down into the feeding zone. Seeing a fair number of dry leaves. Should work well for a good covering at the end. The feeding zone that we've got here seems pretty narrow. But let's see how we can do. Let's see, whole carrot, we'll leave that behind. Let's see if we can reveal some worms that we can add to our enlistees. I guess I'll just turn the whole thing upside down like this and see if I can skim worms off the very bottom. You know, something about these worms, they just seem so large. Really good sized worms. Very content, large, well-fed worms. They're just so intermingled with their food, it's hard to just grab a handful of worms. Let's see if we can do that here. Maybe pick away their food. With the banana peel, it seems pretty easy because you peel the banana peel away and they sort of just drop right off of it if you give it a little shake. That's the way to go. Pull them off the banana peel. There's tons of them on the banana peel. They love it. I think we've already got ourselves a pretty good number of worms here already. This thing's picking up some pretty good weight. But I think we're just going to try to go for maybe one or two more handfuls. Just love how big and fat and well fed these worms all look. They all look very, very happy in here. I'm beginning to think that we've got a fair number of worms in here, probably enough to launch off our new bin with. So why don't we set this aside? We'll finish rebuilding this bin over here so that the migration into this far end can continue for the rest of the worms that are still in this bin. Let's see if I can Just grab one or two more volunteers. Can't seem to resist. There's just so many of them in here. No, you know what? We'll leave that at that. We'll just peel back a little bit so we can do a rebuild here quickly like we've been doing. Just anxious to get to the releasing stage of getting the new bin launched. I think we're in pretty good shape here. We're just going to go ahead and deplete the last of these breadcrumbs. Sprinkle the whole portion down with some grit. And then give them what remains of this coffee. I'm going to save a little bit of this coffee. And I'm going to cover up this stuff. There again, I question if that was the best idea. Because now I got some pretty good leaves right here that would be good to cover up with at the end. So let's see if we can just squeeze in this coffee here on the very edge and let these guys get back to work. Yeah, good enough. Why not? Maybe here too we could just give it a fresh shot of leaves across the top as a covering. Okay. Well, we're going to use this marker here, this coffee filter, as an indicator of where we conducted our last feeding, and now it's showtime. Alright, well, I guess I had the camera in the wrong mode when I released these guys about a minute ago. I'm glad I checked, because the camera was not filming. But like I said, it was only about a minute ago, so I had just kind of gotten done sort of trying to spread these guys out a little bit so they're not just in a big mound piled on top of each other, that they all have a good, fair chance at having access to the material in the bin right beneath them so they could just dive down and feel safe. So I'll just go ahead and get them all spread out here one more time so that hopefully they can all very easily make their way down into the material. Okay, that's official. We've got ourselves a new worm bin, so as customs would dictate, on goes the label with today's date. And I've got a tracking spreadsheet, as some of you might remember from my other videos. I'll make sure there's a log entry in there for this as well. Now my only question is, where am I going to put it? I've got no room left on my shelf. That doesn't matter. That's a problem I'll take care of on my own. I won't bore you with that. Thank you for sticking around. I appreciate your company. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's really appreciated too. Alright everyone, thanks again for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.